How many here have heard of Sripad Ramanujacharya? Ramanujacharya? How many here have heard of Sripad Ramanujacharya? Never heard of Ramanuja? Who here has heard? Can you raise your hand? Okay. Who here has not heard? Can you raise your hand? Okay. That's quite a few devotees here. Okay. So Ramanujacharya was an exalted personality. He's one of the greatest saints of the Vedic tradition. And I will explain why. See, originally, if you go back many, many thousands of years ago, it was very natural for people to worship Krishna or Vishnu. As just a natural part of people's day, every community, every home would have at least a form of worshipping Vishnu. Whether they would offer some food, or whether there was a local temple nearby where everybody would go in the evening. And the worship of Vishnu was an integral part of people's lives. But as Kali Yuga has started and progressed, connection to the Supreme Lord has become extremely diluted. And increasingly, we learn to live our life without reference to the Lord. To help us connect back to Him and to save us from getting into habits that cause personal degradation, the Lord initiated 4 traditions in this Kali Yuga. Those 4 traditions have started from 4 of the Lord's original disciples. So, for example, how many here have heard the term Sri Sampradaya? So the Sri Sampradaya is a tradition starting with Lakshmi Devi herself, hence the name Sri. The term Sri Sampradaya was started when the Lord instructed Lakshmi Devi, and those teachings were passed down. So in that tradition, Sripad Ramanuja is considered to be the most prominent Acharya, who came and established what it meant to worship Vishnu, what it meant to worship Krishna. The other 3 Sampradayas are Lord Brahma, who was also a disciple, and our center, it comes down in that line. So Brahma was instructed. From Brahma, the most prominent Acharya in that line was Sripad Madhvacharya. Who here has been to Udupi or heard about Udupi? I think many people here would have. So in Udupi, of course, Sripad Madhvacharya is the most prominent personality around whom all those teachings and practices are built. So Sripad Madhvacharya has come in the Brahma line. And ISKCON is considered to be the Brahma, Madhava, and the Gaudiya, the Bengal branch of the Madhava line. That's the second of the 4 Sampradayas. The third is what is known as the Nimbarka Sampradaya, and this starts from the 4 Kumaras. The 4 Kumaras were the first children of Brahma, and they were eternal. They are still present, and they're brahmacharis. They've never gotten married. But from the 4 Kumaras, their teachings have passed down to an Acharya. Most prominently, the most prominent Acharya there is Sripad Nimbarkacharya. And you will find his Sampradaya mostly located within the Vrindavan area, and a little bit outside also, but mostly within Vrindavan. And the 4th line was through Lord Shiva himself. So Lord Shiva is the head of a Vaishnava Sampradaya, and the teachings that the Lord has given him has come through an Acharya called Vishnu Swami, whom people say has appeared as Vallabhacharya. Who here has heard about Vallabhacharya? Surely a few people would have. And he's most prominently known through the worship at Natvar, where Sri Nathji is worshipped in the mood of parental affection. So these 4 lines carry forth the Lord's teachings. And through any of these lines, Vaishnavas can understand how to develop one's relationship with the Lord. Now one can ask, why do you need a line at all? Why can't we go directly? I mean, Radha Gopinath is here. Why can't we directly worship the Lord? Well, the thing is, imagine I were to just walk into your family and I were to say, look, there's the head of the family, the father, or the elderly grandfather, if a joint family exists. And I were to enter directly his bedroom, sit on a chair and start talking to him directly. What do you think the first thing, what do you think would happen if I tried to do that? I'd be kicked out. I need a way to enter the household. But there is a way by which people who are strangers, they can enter the house. Just like, for example, imagine you have the son in a family and he gets married to a girl outside. When the girl enters the family, she's not kicked out, she's welcomed in as Lakshmi herself. Through marriage, she enters and becomes a part of the family, and she acquires the privilege of speaking to her father-in-law or the other members of the family in a more intimate way. And many of you would have noticed that usually when you marry into a family, you start addressing your in-laws in the same way that your spouse is addressing them. Who has noticed this? Like if your spouse is calling your father or their father, Papa or Daddy, you also use the same terminology to address your in-laws. And so, or if your cousins are addressed in a particular way, like Chinnu, Minnu, Motu, Chaklu, you address them using the same terms, meaning that the relationship of the husband with those family members is imbibed by the wife. And you acquire, as the wife, the same type of relationship with those family members. Similarly, when we when we join one of these sampradayas, it's like marrying into a family. This is Krishna's family. And we are taught how to feel for Krishna by the association of these exalted personalities. And the relationship between a spiritual master and a disciple, the dynamics are identical in Shastra to that of a husband and a wife. Completely identical. And therefore, when we marry into the spiritual family, we completely are able to take on our husbands, our spiritual masters, or in our case, Srila Prabhupada, who is the principal teacher for everybody who comes into the ISKCON center or movement, how to feel for Krishna. So when we come before Radha Gopinath, you will see that there are certain aratis that take place during the day. There are certain prayers that are recited. These are our exalted predecessors, our exalted family's way of worshipping Krishna. These are their personal prayers, these are their personal realizations. And when we imbibe these personal realizations into our heart, when we regularly chant according to the prayers spoken by our exalted predecessors, our mood of devotion and relationship is immediately established. There's no barrier in between. Some people, sometimes in other traditions, particularly you see this very strongly in the Western monotheistic traditions, that they say that there's no reason for anybody to come in between. They feel like that's more direct. But when we marry into the spiritual family, the relationship becomes much more intimate. And that's what we're after. We're not after, you can become a tax collector and directly barge into a house, but that's not going to guarantee you intimacy. We want intimacy. And so these four sampradayas are Krishna's way of allowing us that intimacy. So we've come to talk about Ramanuja. Ramanuja came in at a time when largely people had forgotten what it meant to have a relationship with the Lord. He appeared actually a little bit more than 1,000 years ago. Did anybody here know that 2016 was when the millennial celebrations were conducted for Ramanuja? And many of you may have heard that in Hyderabad, a huge murti of Ramanuja was installed. Who has heard of this? Yeah? So 2016, this large murti of Ramanuja was installed or was established. And that year marked the 1,000-year millennium of Ramanuja. So we are here today in the brief time that we have about 35 minutes, to explain the center of Ramanuja's teachings and why he's so important, not only to his line, but to everyone who is interested in developing a relationship with the Lord. Who here has read Srila Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita as it is? Who here has seen the book? You've seen it outside? So the Bhagavad Gita as it is, how many of you know that Srila Prabhupada based the Bhagavad Gita on Gita Bhushan, which is Baladev Vidya Bhushan's commentary on the Gita? How many of you know this? How many of you know that Baladev Vidya Bhushan based his commentary on the teachings of Madhvacharya and the teachings of Ramanuja? How many of you know this? Whether we recognize it or not, through Srila Prabhupada's purports, we get Ramanuja's teachings. We get the emphasis of Ramanuja on specific devotional service to the Lord and his rejection of those philosophies that prevent that devotion. And when people know what Ramanuja said, they can find it in Srila Prabhupada's purports. Particularly, you look at 13th chapter, text numbers, I think it's number 2 or 3, and you look at the 2nd chapter. There are specific purports where Srila Prabhupada quotes arguments that are taken from Ramanuja. So Ramanuja, he appeared at a time when Shankaracharya's tradition was most prominent. Now, Shankaracharya is also an exalted personality, and his main service after Lord Buddha had appeared was to re-establish the Vedic scriptures. That's a long history. I will not go into the details now. But Shankaracharya brought credibility to the Vedic tradition, and that's why he's revered. However, Shankaracharya was not able to establish the proper Vedic teachings completely. The reason being was that the Buddhist philosophy was very strongly prominent in India at that time. And so Shankaracharya essentially said, let me take the Buddhist teachings, and particularly there are 4 Buddhist traditions, main Buddhist traditions, Theravada and Mahayana are the 2 main branches. Under each you have 2 subdivisions. Under the Mahayana tradition you have the Shunyavad tradition. He took the teachings of the Shunyavad tradition and he showed that it also comes from the Vedas. This is actually a misapplication of the Vedic teachings. But he did it to re-establish the Vedas and re-establish credibility in the Vedas. Because people said, hey, this is an idea that we accept. And if it's coming from the Vedas and it's easier to acquire the perfections associated or spoken of in these teachings using the Vedas, why didn't I just go to the Vedas directly? So this was Shankaracharya's principal contribution. Ramanuja came many decades or centuries later to further refine the teachings that Shankaracharya established. Shankaracharya established a tradition of commenting on certain critical literatures of the Vedas. He's principally commented on 10 principal Upanishads. He commented on the Bhagavad Gita, he commented on the Vishnu Sahasranamam and the Vedanta Sutra. So by commenting on these literatures, he gave great prominence to these literatures. And they began to be accepted in every community. To establish that a tradition was authorized, the tradition had to provide commentaries to each of these books that I've mentioned. These 11 Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Vishnu Sahasranamam, and the Vedanta Sutra. They had to show that their commentary was not only consistent within a particular literature, but amongst all of these literatures. And that commentary had to stand up to outside scrutiny. Having taken this foundation from Shankara, Ramanuja came in 1,000 years ago. And you can imagine, throughout all of India, Shankara's teachings are completely dominating all Gurukul systems, all school education. Anyone who had to go higher up in society would be taught by somebody who was affiliated with Shankara's school of thought. And Shankara's school of thought, it removed the need to consider Krishna's form as being personal and transcendental. Even if they worshipped Krishna's form, many of you know that Shankara has principal centers in Kanchipuram and in Jagannath Puri, 2 of his many centers. But amongst those, in both those centers, they may worship Lord Jagannath or they may worship Varadaraj. But the thing is, they worship with the idea that one day they want to give up that worship and just remove any sense that they are different from the Lord. This is not the Vedic teaching, which teaches that bhakti is eternal. So Ramanuja, he took the foundation that Shankara had, and he began to preach what the Vedas had in store. What I want to speak about are specific instances in Ramanuja's life that are very, very special and prominent. So first, I want to speak about an incident when he was just a student. So I'm talking about when he was between 6 to roughly about 10 or 13 years old. So Ramanuja was born in Sri Perumbudur, which is a place down in Chennai. And having appeared in Perumbudur, his mother's name was Kantimati. Kantimati's elder brother was already initiated by another great Vaishnavacharya, Yamunacharya. And when Ramanuja appeared in Sri Perumbudur, his father, Sri Keshava, passed away quite quickly, within the first few years of his life. And the family, consisting of his mother, her sister, whose husband had also passed away, and her son. So two single mothers and their children, to ensure that they had better access to support and a community, they moved from Sri Perumbudur to Kanchipuram. Within Kanchipuram, there were many great teachers. And one particular prominent teacher was someone called Yadava Prakasha. Ramanuja began to study under Yadava Prakasha. And of course, Yadava Prakasha was affiliated with the Shankara school of thought. So one day, after all the students, they came for learning and they went back home. Yadava Prakasha was lying on his bed. He had taken his lunch, he was just resting for a short time before he would go back to teaching the students. And Sripad Ramanuja was massaging his leg. He had stayed back to serve his spiritual master. One student came back early from his house. He had a question about a passage from the Chandogya Upanishad, that they'd been studying the Chandogya Upanishad that morning. He came back and he said, "My dear Guru, this passage that is here, I don't understand it." Yadava Prakasha said, "What is that passage?" And the student said, "It is Kapyasam Pundarikam Evam Akshini." It was a passage from the Chandogya Upanishad. Yadava Prakasha, he was just reclining. He said, "This passage is relatively easy to interpret." He said, Pundarikam is the Lord. The Lord is, Vishnu is famous as the lotus-eyed Lord. Pundarikaksha is another name for Vishnu. So he said, Pundarika refers to this Lord. And Akshini means his eyes. So this is a description of the Lord's eyes. And then he said, this Kapi Asam, Kapi means a monkey. And Asam means the rear end of a monkey. So he said, the Lord's eyes are reddish like the rear end of a monkey. And you should understand, when you look at the Lord's eyes, this should be how you visualize it. This is Shankaracharya's type of interpretation, to remove any natural worship of the Lord established in the scriptures. You will see that Shankaracharya's teachings, they take many other passages and they obscure any reference to the personal form of the Lord. You will see that this also happens in the Judaist, Islam, etc. traditions. Whenever there's even the slightest reference to the Lord's hands, legs, his wisdom, it is taken allegorically. And Shankaracharya's teachings do exactly the same thing. When Yadava Prakasha said this, Ramanuja, who was massaging the feet of his guru, he could no longer control himself. Out of etiquette, he couldn't say anything, but from his eyes, just tears started to roll. And despite his trying to control those tears began to fall on Yadava Prakasha's leg. Yadava Prakasha was surprised that hot liquid was falling on his leg. And he turned around and he saw Ramanuja was crying. He said, Ramanuja, what's wrong with you? And Ramanuja folded his hands and said, my dear Guru, when I hear you so badly explain the glories of the Lord or the beauty of the Lord by incorrectly speaking this verse, I'm not able to control my grief. Yadava Prakasha actually became quite angry. When a young kid comes to an elderly professor with literally decades of learning and tells the professor that they're wrong, it's not often a very agreeable thing for a professor to hear. So Yadava Prakasha said, if you know so much, why don't you interpret this passage? And remember, Ramanuja is just a small kid. He has nowhere near the decades of learning and experience that Yadava Prakasha had. But Ramanuja was also connected to the Lord. And based on that inspiration, he said, Kapi can also be understood as Kam Jalam Pibati. He expanded that word into these three phrases. And this means that which drinks water. So Kam Jalam Pibati therefore means the sun, which obviously evaporates all the water on this planet. And so Asam means that which opens out under the sun. So he said this word kapyasam means a lotus flower that opens out in the presence of the sun. And he said, so the Lord's eyes are as beautiful as a lotus flower. In fact, it is said the Lord's eyes, they go like as a lotus petal all the way up to his ears. And his eyes particularly are very restless. They move about just like a fish on a pond. And the most intimate glance of the Lord, just like a sidelong glance, it's a very personal glance. Nobody else sees it happening. And when devotees experience this sidelong glance of the Lord, they experience just this most intimate connection with the Lord that nobody else is aware of. And that's what's indicated in this passage. Kapyasam evam pundarikam akshini. When a devotee meditates on this verse, they come to understand the sweetness and the beauty of the Lord. When they meditate upon this verse, their attraction from the objects of this world, they are drawn away and one focuses on the beautiful nature of the Lord. In fact, it is said in Srimad Bhagavatam, if ever one is attracted by the sex desire, if one simply meditates upon the dancing eyebrows of the Lord, one will become completely sold out to the Lord. Because usually, if you study interactions between men and women, you can tell quite a lot through glances, and with dancing eyebrows. With a mere movement of your eyebrows, you can indicate pleasure, displeasure, or you can indicate a variety of emotions. My wife, for example, when she was young, she made a habit of practicing with her eyebrows. And now she can make a variety of expressions by moving her eyebrows up and down. So it is said that if you meditate upon the dancing eyebrows of the Lord, which speak volumes of information, which speak volumes of intimacy, one will be completely attracted from anything in this world. And this secret is hidden in this passage of the Chandogya Upanishad. When Yadava Prakasha heard this, he was flabbergasted. To have somebody who was merely a kid, like 5-7 years old, speaking such a deep explanation of a rather obscure passage from the Chandogya Upanishad was something he had not encountered before. And that was the first time he felt that here is a real threat. Before then, Ramanuja was his favorite student. But after that time, he started to distance himself away from Ramanuja. Little later on, Ramanuja penned an essay. It was another passage from the Upanishad, which read, Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma. This is one of the favorite passages that is often quoted by the Shankaracharya tradition to establish that the absolute truth is Satyam, it is eternal, it is Jnanam, it is full of knowledge, and it is Anantam, it is unlimited. And the argument goes, how can something that is unlimited be in one specific place at any one time? If you look at the Judaist tradition, there is a philosopher called Maimonides. In the Torah, it is mentioned that the Lord is in the heaven and he is on the earth simultaneously. So Maimonides argues that this is not possible if you have a body. How can one with a body be here and there at the same time? Now this argument assumes that the Lord's form is material. Because my body cannot certainly be in two places at any given point in time. But that's why when we speak of the Lord, we say, how tall is Radha Gopinath? We don't say Radha Gopinath is this tall. We say Radha Gopinath is this tall. Because the Lord's form is unlimited. It is not bounded. It is unlimited. And the Lord's form, he can be a person, yet he can be present in every single atom. And the Upanishads declare this truth. So Ramanuja had taken this passage and he had penned an essay. And you can imagine, you can think of some of the prodigies we have in today's society, where they take a piece of music and they perform it to a standard that is exemplary, even as a 5, 6. How many of you have seen these videos? Like a small kid, doing absurdly complicated calculations, or a small kid playing a very complicated piece. I think many kids may have been exposed to this. Similarly, here was a child prodigy, and he took this passage and he explained how the Lord's feature of Brahman is certainly spread everywhere, but also how he is an individual person. And this essay was actually seen by the head of the Sri Sampradaya, Yamunacharya at that time. And when Yamunacharya read this essay, he thought, this kid will be the next Acharya of this line. And Yamunacharya was trying to find a way to meet Ramanuja. But still we are dealing with Ramanuja. So very soon after penning this essay, Ramanuja went back to his school. And Yadava Prakasha was speaking on this very same passage. And when Yadava Prakasha spoke his explanation, Ramanuja raised his hand. Yadava Prakasha said, "What? What now?" And Ramanuja said, "My dear sir, I would like to say something against what you have said, with your permission." He stood up and synthesized his analysis in that essay. When Yadava Prakasha heard this, he didn't have a refutation. But he sneeringly said, "Here comes another scholar." And he dismissed the class for that day, saying that, "Okay, just all of you go home, we'll continue our studies tomorrow." Yadava Prakasha very soon after that made plans to kill Ramanuja, because he saw Ramanuja as being a real threat to the Sampradaya. And so he brought all of the disciples together under the pretext of having, kind of a regular Gurukul meeting. Ramanuja, of course, was not invited. And Ramanuja's cousin, remember the two cousins who grew up together under the two single mothers. So Ramanuja's cousin Govinda was also not invited. And so Yadava Prakasha began to say, he didn't want to directly say anything in case other students felt bad, because they were also kids. He said, I think you've been noticing that Ramanuja has been acting very audacious lately. And some of the other students, some were older, some were younger, some of the older students said, "Yes, Guru, we've noticed this also. Every time you have an explanation, he stands up and says something different. And this is intolerable. This is beyond any kind of culture and etiquette." And another student said, "Moreover, his teachings are contradicting all that you have taught us and all that Shankaracharya, our great Acharya, has taught us. This is intolerable." And then another student, Yadava Prakasha, was just sitting there happy. He was just waiting for the different students to come to the conclusion he wanted on their own. And another student said, "My dear Guru, I think we need to stop him. We need to completely destroy his arguments." Another student said, "But no, you've seen how learned he is, even as a small kid, and he's not even fully across all the Vedas. With what he knows now itself, it's hard to beat him. What to speak of if he graduates from this school?" Then others said, "Expel him immediately." But then another said, "But he will just go and learn himself. He has not learned any of those things here. He will just learn it himself." Then they were silent for a while. Then one said, "Guru, what if we just..." Sorry, be explicit. What do you mean? What if we just... Do you mean to say that you want to send him somewhere else? What if we just, remove him more permanently? Do you mean kill him? Yes, I mean kill him. Can we do it discreetly? Yadava Prakasha said, "My dear son, I have hesitantly come to the same conclusion. I think we need to do something permanent." And all the disciples said, "Guru, we are completely with you." They said, just imagine, if you have one person in a family that can destroy a family, you have to get rid of that person. This was the same argument, by the way, Vidura used for Duryodhana. He spoke to Dhritarashtra in this way. He said, "This Duryodhana is so bad, he's going to destroy your entire family and your kingdom." So he said, one person can be sacrificed for a family. One family can be sacrificed for a village. One village can be sacrificed for a country, and the entire world can be sacrificed to save one soul and liberate him from this world. And so they quoted this logic and said, "Ramanuja, even though it is forbidden to kill someone who's a Brahmana, even though it's forbidden to kill a young child, nonetheless, I think this is a necessary step." They all made this plan, because they were in South India, in Kanchipuram. They made this plan to go on a Padayatra from Kanchipuram all the way up to the Ganga. So they would have to walk for several months, in fact, because in those days there were no trains or no other easy form of transport. So they were making the plan to go on this Padayatra, and when they were on the Padayatra, away from any other source of community or support, they were planning to dispose of Ramanuja in a place where nobody would question what had happened. They sent out invitations to all of the parents in the Gurukul. And the parents, with great blessings, they sent their sons. Our sons are going to go and see Ganga. That's so fortunate. We wish we could come also. No, please, you go and come with a purified heart. All of them gathered together, and Ramanuja and Govinda went also. As they kept going up through North India, they came to the Ganga. They took a bath in the Ganga, and then they sat down. The time to enact their plan had come about. Very close to that area was a very rich and luscious forest, miles away from any other civilization. Nobody even knew where they were at that point. They said, if we cut him up now and bury him here, nobody will ever come to know. We can even just drown him and then just say he drowned in the Ganga. They were finalizing the details of their plan, when accidentally they were not careful enough. Govinda came to overhear what their plans were. He freaked out and he ran to his cousin Ramanuja and said, Ramanuja, you've got to run. Ramanuja said, what do you mean? He said, they're planning to kill you. Run, just go. How? I don't have anything. Just go. And so Ramanuja, he just practically, just a young kid, he just, whatever he had, he just left. He just left it there, and empty-handed, barefoot, with only the clothes on his back, he ran from that place. When the other students came back, they saw Ramanuja was just gone. They assumed that he had just lost himself in the forest, or he had gone out for something, he had not come back. They waited there for a few days. When Ramanuja didn't come back, they assumed that he was just lost, he had been eaten by a jungle animal, because there were many of them there. They said, good, our hands are completely clean, and we have satisfied why we have come here. They started to come back. But let's discuss what happened to Ramanuja. He was running, and the sun just kind of started to set. A young child, no food, no water, no nothing. And he came to a dense part of the forest. He didn't know which way was north, east, south, because he needed to go south to go home. He needed to at least find a village, or needed to find a place that he could follow into some level of civilization. There was nothing. And as he was just lying down, tired out by that day's exertions, there was a hunter and his wife who came in that direction. The hunter and his wife, they were coming, they saw this kid, and Ramanuja stood up and said, my dear sir, can you please guide me? I need to go home to Kanchipuram. Kanchipuram? You're a long way from home. And he said, yes, I came with my group, I got lost, I need guidance. The hunter said, we're also going in the way of Kanchipuram. Now Ramanuja, interestingly, super intelligent person, he didn't ask, how is it that a hunter in North India is going to Kanchipuram in South India? Why does a hunter whose livelihood depends upon the killing of animals need to travel all the way from North India to South India? But there was something about the hunter that made him feel he felt very connected to him. He felt like, here's a person I can actually take shelter of. So he just laid down there. And as he was lying down, the hunter went to get some implements. Perhaps it was actually the next day morning, actually. So the hunter, they all woke up. Ramanuja had felt refreshed. And the hunter, he just went away to get something. The hunter's wife, she asked for some water. And she said, there's a lake nearby, like a small pond. Can you just get me some water? So Ramanuja went down to get some water for the hunter's wife. When he came back, the wife had disappeared and the hunter himself had disappeared. He looked around for a long time and he didn't find them. So he didn't know where they'd gone. So he just kept walking in the same direction that the hunter and his wife had initially taken him. And as he kept walking, he found another person coming towards him. He said, my dear sir, which way is Kanchipuram? That person looked at Ramanuja like he was crazy. He said, what kind of question are you asking? I know you. You are Kantimati's son. Ramanuja was surprised. How do you know me and how do you know my mother? I've seen you around. Hey, boy, this is Kanchipuram. What? I was miles away from Kanchipuram. How did I end up here? And he said, look, that is a temple. That is Lord Varadaraja's temple. And the pond that he had taken water from was the pond that is used for the service of Lord Varadaraj. And Ramanuja was thunderstruck. This other individual, he was just shaking his head, wondering what had happened, and he went away. Ramanuja at that point realized that the hunter and his wife were none other than Lord Narayan himself and Srimati Lakshmi Devi. At that point, he completely broke down. And he began to loudly chant a verse. Namo Brahmanya Devaya Go Brahmana Hitaya Cha Jagat Hitaya Krishnaya Govindaya Namo Namaha. And after that, he began to chant the prayers of Queen Kunti from the Srimad Bhagavatam. Because Queen Kunti, she had just seen Krishna. And this was the time when the Brahmastra, or the Brahmashira more precisely, was attacking Parikshit Maharaj in Uttara's womb. And she had just seen Krishna standing outside, but then entering the womb to save Parikshit. And when she saw that, she was feeling like, all this time I've been walking with scales over my eyes. I've been thinking of Krishna in a particular way, but this is his actual glory. And this was the same feeling that Ramanuja had. I was with the Supreme Lord, but I was just thinking that he was someone ordinary. My feeling told me that he was someone I could take shelter of. But now I see that this is the Supreme Lord himself. And when the Lord revealed himself to Ramanuja in this way, he felt attracted to Kunti's prayers. And he began to recite those prayers with great satisfaction. He went back home, and his parents were overjoyed to see him. When he went there, he told his mother in secret what had happened. They were shocked, but decided to keep this knowledge to just themselves. At that point, Ramanuja decided, let me just study myself. And he began to associate more closely with the chief pujari of Kanchipuram, of Lord Varadaraj, Kanchipurna. Kanchipurna was also, like his uncle, a disciple of the great Yamunacharya. And under Kanchipurna, he studied the Shastras to grow more in his understanding and knowledge of the Lord. We don't have a lot of time, but I do want to speak to more instances. When Yadava Prakasha came back, and this is just a brief interim, he was surprised to see Ramanuja there. He had been regretting actually disposing of Ramanuja, or planning to dispose him. So he was actually pleased to see Ramanuja. He said, son, please come back. But there was another altercation, after which he dismissed Ramanuja completely. In the meantime, Yamunacharya in Srirangam had been looking for an opportunity to meet Ramanuja. Remember, after Ramanuja had penned that essay on that passage, Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma, he'd been looking for an opportunity to meet Ramanuja. So he came all the way to Kanchipuram to meet him. Now, this was a time when Ramanuja was still actually a student. So when he came, he saw that Ramanuja was Yadava Prakasha's favorite student, and Yadava Prakasha had Ramanuja close by and had his arm around Ramanuja. And Yamunacharya didn't want to approach Ramanuja at that time because he felt because Yamunacharya was the head of a Vaishnava line, and Yadava Prakasha was a prominent personality in the Shankara line. Had they met, it would have been an unpleasant scene. So Yamunacharya didn't try anything at that time. But seeing Ramanuja under the shelter of someone who was in the impersonalist tradition, Yamunacharya was very disturbed. And he went with great feeling before Lord Varadaraj. And he on the spot composed a set of prayers that have become famous as the Stotra Ratna. Who here has heard or read of the Stotra Ratna prayers? Prabhupada actually quotes 2 or 3 of these verses in his purports, in the Chaitanya Charitamrita and in the Bhagavad Gita. One famous verse from there is Bhavantameva nucharan nirantara prashanta nishesha manoratantara kadahame kanta nitya kinkara praharsha yashyami sanata jivitam. So Yamunacharya is saying, oh my Lord, when will that day come when I just become the servant of your servants? And I become Sanata. I'm right now Anath. I'm an orphan in this world. I don't have anyone I can take shelter of. But when will that day come when taking shelter of your servants, I can feel like I have a protector, a master, and stop just whirling around on the chariot of my mind? Another famous verse from Stotra Ratna, Sakritvadakara vilokanasya Trini krittanuttama bhukti muktibi Mahatma beravalokyam naya Kshane pite yad virahati dusaha. This verse is wonderful, and it says, my dear Lord, may that time come when I appear in the glance of your servant who has such eagerness to behold your transcendental form that they consider sense enjoyment and liberation to be like straw on the street, and from whom separation is completely unbearable, even for you. So this is the quality of the prayers. I think the Stotra Ratna has about 43, 44 verses. And anybody who studies these verses has access to an incredible amount of devotion. The Stotra Ratna is very, very famous among Vaishnavas. And it is very, very common that Vaishnavas take shelter of these verses in building a relationship with the Lord. And it was composed at this time when Yamunacharya, seeing Ramanuja in this position, he went before Lord Varadaraj and began to speak these verses. And his prayer was, may Ramanuja be freed from this association. So when Ramanuja and Yadava Prakasha parted ways, Yamunacharya heard this and he was overjoyed. Yamunacharya, of course, was in Sri Rangam. And he sent his very dear disciple, Mahapurna. He sent Mahapurna to Kanchipuram to bring Ramanuja back. And when Mahapurna went there, he saw Ramanuja. Ramanuja had one service, that was to bring water for Lord Varadaraj. So he would go to that sarovar that he had taken water for the huntress from, and he would take water from there in a pot, and he would take it for the service of Lord Varadaraj. So as he was carrying the pot, Mahapurna knew exactly how to attract him. He began to recite the verses composed by Yamunacharya. And these verses, nothing of which had ever been heard before, attracted Ramanuja's ears like anything. And he heard them for some time, and then he put his pot down, and he said, my dear sir, who are you? And where have these verses come from? Who has composed these verses? They create an ecstasy in my heart that I've never known before. And Mahapurna said, they have been composed by my revered spiritual master, Yamunacharya. And my spiritual master eagerly desires to meet you. And Ramanuja was surprised that his name, because in his mind, he was some tiny soul in some village. And imagine one exalted personality somewhere just says, I want to meet you. It's a cause for great surprise. And Ramanuja was overjoyed and in amazement. He said, my dear sir, give me 1 minute. He took that pot of water, he rushed to the temple, he placed the pot for Varadaraj service, took Kanchipurna's permission. He didn't bother to go back home to tell his parents. He just rushed with Mahapurna and they went back. Unfortunately, actually Yamunacharya was in the very last stages of his pastimes in this world. And by the time they got there, Yamunacharya had gone back to Lord Narayan's service. But Yamunacharya, and there are many, many details on this journey that one can speak about. But I want to speak about this one thing. When Yamunacharya was lying on his samadhi bed, three of his fingers, and I don't know if it was the left hand or the right hand, but 3 fingers were clenched like this. And the Ramanuja, he just came there and he was grief-stricken. And he saw these 3 fingers being clenched in this way. And he said, my dear sir, he asked one of the devotees there, was this Yamunacharya's natural hand gesture during his presence here? And they said, no, it was perfectly straight and normal. So then he said, did he have any unfulfilled wishes? They said, we don't know our master's mind, but maybe there was something. So Ramanuja, it appeared to people around them that Ramanuja went into some kind of trance. And as he stood there, he began to say, I promise that I will write a commentary that establishes the glory of Lord Narayan on the Vedanta Sutra. And as soon as he said this, 1 finger went out. Then he said, I promise that I will establish 64 centers around this Bharatvarsha to preach the glories of Lord Narayan. a second finger went out. And then he said, my last promise is that in honor of Sri Parashara Muni, who has so wonderfully penned the glories of Lord Vishnu in the Vishnu Purana, I will name an appropriate individual by the name Parashara. Yamunacharya's finger straightened. This pramana, this evidence was enough to instruct all of the disciples present there that Yamunacharya had wanted Ramanuja to carry out these three wishes and become the next head of the Sampradaya. They persuaded Ramanuja to stay, but Ramanuja said, I don't want to stay in the service of the Lord who has taken my master away from me so early. I will not stay with Lord Ranganath, I will go back to Kanchipuram. And he went back. But here's the thing. The devotees at Sri Rangam, they wanted Ramanuja to come back. So they sent a messenger to Lord Varadaraj, because they knew if we tell Ramanuja, he's not going to come. But if Varadaraj mentions this, then he has to come. So they went to Lord Varadaraj. Now, Lord Varadaraj, this was 1,000 years ago, he would, and amongst his devotees, he would come personally with his consort. And Lord Varadaraj has a particular affinity for the music of Swarga Loka, of the melodies, of the style of music. So when his glories were sung in that manner, he would not be able to control himself. So these performances were there on a regular basis. Just before one of these performances, this messenger came and he had a letter. And this letter was personally from Lord Ranganath himself. This letter said, my dear Varadaraj, please accept my respects. I hope you're well. Blah, 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 blah. And Lord Ranganath had glorified Lord Varadaraj in many, many verses. And Varadaraj was sitting, he was listening, he was happy. And then the last verse said, if you're so kind, please give me Ramanuja. Varadaraj was shaken up and he said, who has sent this message? That messenger? Don't let him stay here. I don't want him to have a house. Pack him up right now, take him back. And the messenger was confused. He just took that and he went back to Lord Ranganath. Ranganath had another plan. He sent Yamunacharya's own son, Vararanga. Vararanga was famous for his musical ability. So Vararanga came and he knew Varadaraj's weakness of that he was particularly attracted to Devgan. So when Vararanga came there in one of those performances, he began to sing according to the musical strains of Swarga music. And as he was singing, Varadaraj couldn't control himself. And his Lakshmi Devi was saying, remember Lord, you're a deity. He said, I can't control myself. And he just jumped up and he just started dancing in the courtyard. And then Lakshmi Devi also said, his two consorts, they said, Lord, we also want to come. We also can't control ourselves. He said, come, who's stopping you? And the Lord and his two consorts began to dance in ecstasy to Vararanga's music. The Lord said, Vararanga, you've pleased me so much, take a benediction. He kept singing. Second time, Vararanga, you've pleased me so much, please take a benediction. He kept singing. And he said, Vararanga, please take a benediction. Lord, you'll give me a benediction? Yes, I promise you. Anything I ask, apart from my wife, anything you ask. And then he said, you promise anything I ask? Yes, as I've told you, anything you ask. He said, I want, and then the Lord said, haven't you read the scriptures? Haven't you said, I'm Satyavratam, Satyaparam, Satyam, Trisatyam. I'm always called Satyam. And then the Vararanga said, I want Ramanuja. Everything stopped. Varadaraj said, I should have excluded him also. Ask for something else, I can't give him. Then Vararanga said, then go back to your scriptures. Everywhere you've used the word Satyam, cross it off. And then he said, I can't do that. People in Kali Yuga will die. And then he said, okay, I'm quickening the story. But he said, Varadaraj began to cry. He called Ramanuja. Ramanuja said, for what offense are you sending me, my lord? Varadaraj said, I've been tricked. It's beyond my control right now. Please, you have to go. Ramanuja walked backwards the whole way from Kanchipuram to Srirangam. The entire time his eyes were fixed on Lord Varadaraj. From the Pastimes of Ramanuja, we learn two very important things. An emphasis on pure devotional service and Vaishnava Seva. The glories of Ramanuja are deep like an ocean and one can continue to speak of them unlimitedly. There is a bookshop in Srirangam which has 16 volumes on the pastimes of Ramanuja, all in pure Tamil. I wish I could read them. But nonetheless, we should know that these are our great predecessors. Lord Chaitanya took these two important principles from Ramanuja. That is an emphasis on pure bhakti and worship of the Vaishnavas. And today, we have tried to speak a simple drop of the ocean of his pastimes, which are capable of satisfying the hearts of all. We're going to have Gaur Aarti now. Please do stay. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Abhishek Prabhu ki jai.
Gopinath Bhaktivinoda ki jai.
Namo